welcome again this month. Fred, I think you've already heard all this, so you can add in. I think I saw Fred back there. You can add in whatever you want. In case you're wondering, these are Highway Department employees. Well, that I don't know. This photo is from 1919. They were surveyors working on the black and white trail. Anybody know what the black and white trail was? It was a precursor to the Beartooth Highway, and it was intended to cross the Beartooth Plateau over into Wyoming. And we actually let a contract with Carbon County to build the road in 1919, but we only got to the top of the hill, and that's as far as we ever got. So if you ever go down to Red Lodge, and I think you can still see pieces and parts of the old road up the side of Mount Maurice, and I understand you can go walk it and ATV it if you want, but these guys were working on the survey crew for that early road over the Beartooth. Apparently they had their priorities straight, I would say. So with that, today I'm going to talk about, hopefully, if I can get the arrows to work. Let's see if I can get this thing. How did we do it last time, Cliff? Do you remember?
You left click on the mouse and you can hang on to it.
Left click. Okay. So we just... There we go. All right. So today I'm going to talk about the Highway Department's history from 1913 up until the beginning of World War II. And that's a lot of territory to cover. There was an awful lot going on here during those years. I would argue that during the 1930s that you could say that it was really the first golden age here at the MDT as far as construction went, because it was during the Great Depression, and the government did what governments always do, and did most recently, they passed stimulus funding. And so that stimulus funding in the 30s was intended to put people back to work building highways. And so that's what really ushered in, I think, the first golden age. But we'll get to that here in just a minute. In March 1913, Governor Sam Stewart signed the legislation creating the Montana State Highway Commission. And it was quite an event for him. There was virtually no opposition to the creation of a highway department or a highway commission in 1913. Most other states were getting them at that time, so it was part of a national trend. In Montana, at least during the legislative session, there was absolutely nobody that voted against the legislation to create the commission. But the problem was that they didn't really give them any money to do anything. They had a budget of $5,000 a year, and that money was mostly for how to kind of promote the message of good roads around Montana to the counties. There wasn't any money in the budget to actually build any roads. They didn't have enough funds to do that. There was 3 men on that first commission. They're all political appointees then, just like they are now. All 3 of them were civil engineers. One came from Montana State College, which was the engineering school back then as well. Another one was a state engineer, a man by the name of Archie Mahan. And then the 3rd man was the county surveyor from Beaverhead County, a man named George Metlin. And Metlin was actually the only paid member of the commission. He got $3,500 a year for a salary, and his job was mainly, supervising one employee, and that was a stenographer. And so actually the second employee of the highway department was a woman. So that's a good thing. She didn't stay very long, and then they got a male stenographer because they had that kind of thing in those days. But Metlin's job essentially was to travel around the state, talk to the counties, and promote the ideas of good roads, and bridges, and tell those people how you built them. But he didn't have any money to give them to actually do it. So, but the commission met its first meeting on April 4th, 1913. They just sat down and kind of worked out the basic organization of the commission. They organized a conference with all the county surveyors and county commissioners to come to Helena to meet and talk about issues that were important to them as far as roads and bridges went. And And then that was essentially it. Oh, there's one other thing. They also told the commission decided that George Metlin was going to have a map made of Montana showing where all the roads were. And out of that first map, they would be able to establish a first state highway system. And that state highway system became the basis for the federal system that we have today. They met in the state capitol, and excuse me, that's where the offices of the State Highway Commission were located in the state capitol up until 1936. And then they moved into their first building, which is just across the street from the capitol at the corner of Roberts and 6th Avenue, where livestock is today. So I think you can go in there, and I'm sure there's nobody here today that worked in that old building before this one was built. You guys did? So you were in there, huh? God, you're dating yourselves. But I think if you go in the lobby, there's still a mural on the wall there that Shorty Show painted of the Mullen Road. And so I haven't been in there. I'm kind of I've been always over to the Historical Society and forget to go to the other. What that first meeting with the state commission, highway commissioners did determine was that what they would do was promote the use of convict labor. They didn't have to pay for it, so it's kind of a good thing. Convict labor at that time for building highways, the counties paid the bill essentially. And so what the MDT did was, or the highway commissioners did, was provide the guidelines for how they should build those roads, how they should build modern roads. And it wasn't until later in the 1910s that we actually started buying them equipment for the use on the convict crews, and then eventually we did start paying for the salaries of the guards who were at the convict camps that were watching the laborers. This was the first convict project that the Highway Commission was involved with. It's along the east side of Flathead Lake, where I don't remember the name of the highway now, 35 is today. And there's a great highway historical marker there too. You should stop and read about it. But what they ended up using convict labor for mostly was for heavy excavation projects, where it took a lot of rock removal and dirt removal and that type of thing. It wasn't really cost effective to use them in eastern Montana. And they didn't really want to use them in eastern Montana for other reasons as well. Anybody have an idea what that might have been? It's a lot easier to make your escape if you're in eastern Montana. So you have somewhere to go. In western Montana, you didn't really have anywhere to go, apparently, or that was their thinking back then. Unfortunately, I don't have any photos of those first commissioners. I'm still trying to put some together. This is kind of an idea what kind of road equipment they used in those days. Pretty primitive to what we have now. They're building roads for the most part that aren't paved. They're gravel surfaced or dirt surfaced, or else they're surfaced with scoria. So it's no paving until 1921. And I'll get to that here in just a minute. So just to give you an idea what that early equipment looked like. What the Highway Commission did do was publish pamphlets on how to build modern roads. And their first pamphlet, and this is a real doozy, and this, if you guys have insomnia, this will cure it real fast. It's on the drainage of roads. It's on how to build culverts and how to crown the road so the water drains off of it, not pool on the road itself. I did try and read it because I thought it would be important, you know, if I could actually discuss it at one of these talks, but nobody's going to want to talk about the drainage of roads, I decided after reading that. Another example of road construction at the time, they use a lot of horses on these. The horses usually pull the scrapers and that type of thing. They usually hired local labor on these. They're all county projects, mind you. The counties are actually funding them, and they're actually designing the roads, at least at first. But they hired local labor who were working off their road taxes by working on road projects. If you owned a horse team, then you got paid a little bit extra than the regular labor did. Another example, this is on the Billings to Laurel Road, what would be eventually known as Yellowstone Trail and then as US Highway 10. So as you can see, it's pretty primitive stuff. It's mostly pick and shovel work and with horses. And this is a convict gravel spreader. that is on there. This is from the 1921 or 1915 biennial report for the department, and it's just filled with photos of convict labor. And because that was really the only kind of labor that, or any kind of projects the Highway Commission really had any control over. But in the process, you got fairly decent roads. I mean, it was really important at this time because more people are buying automobiles. These are the people that really were lobbying the hardest to have the Highway Commission created in the first place. They're trying to get good roads built so they could drive their cars on. There's also that secondary part of it is that it also helps the commerce in these areas in Montana. This is also occurring during the midst of the homestead boom, where Montana's population increased to almost 1 million people by 1918. And so all these eastern counties needed good infrastructures for all their new residents, and so that's where a lot of the lobbying is coming for the creation of the Highway Commission as well. And a lot of the impetus for the building of good roads is coming from eastern Montana, not so much in the west. I'll give you 2 points if you know where this photo was taken. It's on the east side of McDonald Pass heading up the hill. So, you know, it was because of our not so much our direct influence on road building in the 1910s, but because we were involved in it at some level, the counties were getting a little bit more serious about it, that we did start getting some relatively decent roads. But as you can see, they're still rather primitive. I mean, what's going to happen to this road when it snows or during the spring thaw? It's not going to be looking quite that good. It was during the 1910s that some really remarkable things were constructed in association with our roads. One of them is this log crib retaining wall. And this is along US Highway 10, just to the west of Alberton. And if you drive to over Lookout Pass and you get to, I think, the Sear exit, before you get to the Sear interchange and you look off to your left across the river, you can still see pieces and parts of this. That's the Northern Pacific Railroad's line to Wallace, Idaho, right up above it. And they've kind of worked on that fill material, so a lot of that is covered over this log retaining wall, but you can still see it when you drive along I-90 and look across the river. But again, these roads really aren't lasting very long. This is what it would have looked like probably in the spring of 1918, somewhere thereabouts. Not a particularly good thing to drive, even with the Model T, with the kind of shocks that they had. I mean, imagine it wasn't very much fun to do that. This is a little piece of US Highway 2. It's called the Theodore Roosevelt International Highway then. So, I mean, it's nothing like like we're used to today. I'll put it that way. And then this section up US Highway 87 up around the Big Sandy area. So during the spring thaw. So it's just kind of a miserable thing getting anywhere in Montana. Even with the Highway Commission, it's trying to do its best with $5,000 a year to really improve how these roads are built. This is a photograph of the Yellowstone Trail branch down to Yellowstone Park through Yankee Jim Canyon. That road's still there today. You can actually drive it as long as you have on a high clearance vehicle to do it. I don't think you want to do it in your Ford Fusion, if at all possible. And then, of course, breakdowns are going to be common as well. And some of you heard this before. I love this photograph because you can tell whose car it is that got the flat tire, because of who's giving him the stink eye there on the right. And she's not happy. And those other two people are being smart and staying out of the way. But all this is going to change. One thing about the Highway Department's history is that it's in a continuous state of change, especially after 1960. That year, the federal Congress passed the first Federal Aid Road Act. And in that Road Act, they allocated $75 million to the county, or to the states, to be able to work on improving their road systems. What they're trying to do is create an interstate highway system. We've got all these highways that are all connected to each other, and really that would facilitate commerce across the state, or across the country as well. So in 1916, Congress passed this Road Act, and it's really a seminal piece of legislation because it does get the feds directly involved in road construction in the states. And it makes it so that the states become increasingly more reliant on federal funds to get those roads built. And mainly because the feds can exercise more control through the states on how they're constructed, make sure they meet standards and so forth. So 1960, keep that date in mind if you go to a party or sometime you need something to talk about. Federal Aid Road Act of 1916 might be a good one. Montana got $1.5 million out of that legislation. It was based a lot on population and on the amount of public land there was in the states. And that would be the way that it would be all throughout the Federal Aid Highway Act period. Montana got $1.5 million. The counties had to match that money if they wanted projects built. But in return, the highway, this is what created the Highway Department. There's a Highway Commission and a Highway Department. The Highway Department had to survey for these roads. They also had to oversee the bidding process, make sure that that was all on the up and up when it was let the contract. And then we also had a resident engineer on these projects, which we still do today. And then before we could pay the contractor, they had to be accepted by the state. So that's really how our system today really, what's where it originated was in 1960 with this. So, but throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the feds would be taking more and more control over this whole process. One thing that'll happen after this legislation is passed in 1917, the legislature does away with that three-man highway commission. It keeps George Metlin on staff for a couple of years, but Metlin didn't get along very well with this guy. This is Frank Conley, and I'll talk a little bit more about him in a second. But so the legislature replaced the three-man commission with a 12-man commission. Now it seems to me when you're adding more and more people into the mix that it's going to become a lot more complicated, which they did foresee that. So even though there's a 12-man commission, they meet 4 times a year, but there is a 3-man executive committee that's taken from the commission, and they meet every month. And then the chairman of that executive committee is essentially the director of the highway department, even though there is also a chief highway engineer at that time as well. And that man's name is Paul Pratt. He's the first chief highway engineer. 1917, what happened? So it's going to cause all this to kind of come to a halt. World War I. Hope you're all excited about celebrating the centennial of World War I starting next year. But and not only that, the guy who was the chairman of the Highway Commission also had some connections to a German spy ring in Butte. A guy named Oscar Rohn. And it's all very interesting. I think there's a good article there for somebody because it's very complicated as well. Because it's all happening when Butte's undergoing a really nasty time of labor problems. But so Oscar Rohn lasted only until 1918, and then they appointed this man, Frank Conley, to be the chief highway, or be the chairman of the executive committee. Conley looks like a tough guy, doesn't he? Believe me, you don't want to piss him off. 1908, he was awarded at the state prison in Deer Lodge. 1908, there was an escape attempt. One of the prisoners cut his throat. Conley lived and recovered, and when they hanged that man, Conley was the man that pulled the lever on the trap of the scaffold and said that supposedly vengeance is mine. So this was a tough guy, but he's also a little bit morally ambiguous. He's not quite. This is the guy that's actually assigning which projects the convicts are going out on these convict road projects that we're involved with here at the department, right? Which the counties are paying, for the use of those convicts on these projects. Well, Conley becomes chairman of the commission, and it seems to me that that might set a red flag up, right? Well, it didn't. But eventually in 1921, it would all come crashing down on him when the governor didn't like him, would take him to court, and he'd lose his job. He was making an ungodly amount of money, and he only had an annual salary through the state of $4,000. I think, when I understand it, his annual salary was 10 times that amount. But he ruled the department with an iron hand. He was the one that made the decisions about where the money was going to be spent, how it was going to be spent, who was going to do the work, and so forth. And nobody seemed to really cross him very much. And, you know, he's tough enough that I think I can understand why they might not do that. So this is Frank Conley. And you might hear about him more in the future because I think people are getting kind of interested, or historians are getting interested in him. One thing he does do is establish the state or the highway department's fair shop out at the fairgrounds. I know some of you have been involved in that over the years because it's what a hazardous waste nightmare out there, pretty much. And but he established that building is still there. And but Conley decides, oh well, and we're using an awful lot of convict labor on these highway projects, that maybe the shop ought to be in Deer Lodge out of the prison. So he moved it out to Deer Lodge, and they built a really nice brick building to house it. And so what you're seeing under Conley's leadership, that they're centralizing a lot of that authority on the prison and not so much here in Helena where it's supposed to be. So, but again, that's a little piece of highway department history that's still here. For how much longer, I don't know. But importantly, the highway department gets involved with the surveying, the design, and the awarding of contracts for highway projects that are funded by the counties, essentially. Now, that federal money is being used essentially to pay the salaries for the people working for the department. So the first project they let the contract was in April 1919, and it was for the Black and White Trail up the side of Mount Maurice, Carbon County, outside of Red Lodge. And of course, it didn't get very far, but it was a start. And during that period, let me check my notes here because it's got numbers in it. I don't remember numbers very well. During this period, excuse me, I'm being a little, should have looked at this first. Well, from 1919 to 1921, they oversaw the awarding of 71 contracts with the counties, and they built about 340 miles of road. So it's a fairly, it's fairly successful the way it's working. They have to build these to standards, so at least you're getting modern highways, supposedly. This is the kind of equipment they would have been using on it. What Conley did was broker a deal with the feds to acquire a lot of war surplus equipment after World War I. So that surplus equipment was owned by the department, and then he would lease it out to whoever he thought should use it. So it was mostly leased out to the counties, but there were, just starting to be a few highway contractors that specialized in that kind of work, and he would lease it out to them as well. So you're still seeing that control, that if Conley didn't like what you were doing, you just wouldn't get this equipment. So it's not really working the way, that I think the federal government intended it to work. Some more equipment. I think this is a little bit newer. Yeah, but they're still relying quite a bit on pick and shovel work and on horses as well. I'm not sure exactly where this photo was taken. Pardon? Klein, okay, between Roundup and Billings. But still, you're getting roads that are going to do this in the springtime, because we just don't have the money and the material available to really build a modern road to the standards that we're more used to today. In the forested areas, it's still direct federal work through the Bureau of Public Roads. We have absolutely no control over those other than allocating the money for these projects on an annual basis. But the Bureau of Public Roads is the one that designs and oversees the construction. But there were some segments of paved roads. This is the oldest paved section of road in Montana. It was built in 1921. It's also the earliest section. I think it was the first one. This went between Butte and Anaconda, and parts of it are still there. Parts of it have been paved over by the county since just over the last 10 years or so. But they are thinking about modern concrete roads at this point, and which is a good thing. But they're only building those in high traffic areas like between Butte and Anaconda, around Billings, around Great Falls, and in those places. Bozeman had some of the first concrete road as well. is the Scout the Whole Road. Scout the Whole Road was a federally funded project, and we were directly involved with the design and construction of that particular road. There was a big problem with the contractor. We kept making change orders, and the contractor wasn't getting paid for the extra work. And finally, he sued the department, and that lawsuit went all the way up to the 1930s before they finally finished it. 1921 is another big year. Like I said, you know, this is a constantly evolving process, and it's all for the better. 1921, with the Federal Aid Road Act, Montana again got $1.5 million from the feds. And the states, or the counties, did have to match that money. The state also matched a lot of those funds by enacting the first gasoline tax. 1921, it was for 1 cent a gallon. But it seems like it might not be that much money, but actually it was a fair amount of funds. But we didn't get all that revenue. Most of it went back to the counties. We only got like 20% of it out. And during the 1920s, the legislature constantly cut back on that. So by the time 1926 rolled around, that we were getting virtually nothing out of the gasoline tax, nothing that we could use. Another important part of that that legislation is that it compelled the department to form a maintenance division. So our maintenance division dates back to 1921. And it also created something called the 7% system. The 7% system was 7% of the total road mileage in the states. In Montana, that equated to like 4,772 miles. That was constituted the 7% system. And this is what it looked like in 1921. And what's under that legislation in 1921, you could only expend federal funds on federal aid primary system. You couldn't spend it on county roads anymore. It had to be on the 7% system. So that really limited the amount of where the money could be spent. It made it easier to concentrate the money a little bit, easier to really make some progress on improving these roads. One thing I've noticed from the Highway Commission records, though, is that almost none of the counties were exactly happy with it because they lost out, essentially. They lost more control over the road building process as a result of this legislation, and they kept trying to add and take out roads. So they would show up at the commission meetings every month, and they would start complaining about what was, I mean, we think this road ought to be on there, not that one. And what I have noticed is the commissioners mostly didn't listen to them. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they did maintain this basic system all the way up through the 1950s. Some road improvements, things were getting, I don't know. Thankfully for the Bridge Bureau, got any Bridge Bureau people here? Montana had the best bridges, among the best bridges in the western U.S., but we had rumored the worst highways in the United States in the 1920s. And that's because there's really no funds to spend on it. They're not getting enough money to really do any good road building. So going anywhere could really be ugly in the 1920s. This guy, I think, kind of says it all. Things change again in 1926. 1926, the governor and highway commissioners and a lot of the legislatures and some of the Good Roads groups pushed through something called the Good Roads Law. And it's taken to the public. It's voted on in November 1926, and it overwhelmingly passes. And what that legislation did was it raised the gasoline tax to 3 cents a gallon. And it made sure that all that money went into the Highway Trust Fund. So counties weren't siphoning it off. There was another group siphoning off that money. It's all going into road building. And it's with that legislation that the MDT takes full control of the whole road building process in Montana. That we're not relying on the counties anymore. The counties are terrible to deal with because they keep changing their minds and say, well, we want this project, and they'll go and spend money, state and spend money doing survey work and the design work, and then the county will say, well, maybe we don't want that one after all. We just don't have the money to do it. So working with the counties was extremely frustrating. But with this legislation in 1926, we didn't have to rely on it anymore. that we could do what we thought was right. We spent the money. We've matched the federal funds. And so we designed the roads, and we did everything we were doing before, except now we were awarded the contracts. It became really our responsibility, not the responsibility of the counties. And so things, start to look up a little bit in the late 1920s. We still have a reputation of having the worst roads in the country, but I think things are definitely starting to improve a little bit, and then something happens again in 1929. Asking you all to think back to high school history. The stock market crashed in October 1929, and that caused the domino effect that created the Great Depression that really hit Montana in 1930. So Montana was hurting badly. This is after the end of the homestead boom. We lost probably a third of our population that we had during World War I. There's not that many people in eastern Montana. They're not there. What aren't they doing that we really need them to do? We need them to pay taxes, and we need them to drive cars and buy gasoline. So with the Depression, more people left the state, and more people were cutting back. And so that tax revenue was really starting to dry up in the early 30s. This all kind of sounds familiar? I was thinking of that just a few years ago. This all sounds exactly the way it was 70 years ago. So Montana couldn't provide the matching funds that it needed to get federal money to work on highway projects. So what do you think the government did? Stimulus money. Essentially, beginning in 1932 under the Hoover administration. The Hoover administration has a horrible reputation as not being very receptive to the unemployed in the United States during that time. Actually, the Hoover administration established the guidelines that Franklin Roosevelt would pick up for the New Deal during his administration. So in 1932, the first emergency relief projects were led by the department. These are projects that are essentially totally federally funded. So the feds provide all the money, and the state promises at some point in the future that it'll pay the federal government back for its part of the matching fund. That didn't ever happen. That never happened. But it was a good idea. At least it got people put people back to work. It's all pick and shovel work. There's a requirement that it has a minimal amount of power equipment. It's intended to put as many unemployed to work as you possibly can on improving your infrastructure. And it really works well. It's during that decade between the first relief program and the New Deal that over 7,300 miles of highway are improved in Montana. And about 2/3 of that were improved under the auspices of the Highway Department. So it's an extremely successful program, I think. When Franklin Roosevelt takes over in March of 1933, passes the National Industrial Recovery Act, and there's money specifically earmarked in that legislation to put into work on highway projects, roads and bridges. So that really did a lot here in Montana by putting into work who were unemployed. And one of the stipulations was that you had to be a resident of the state, that you couldn't come from out of state and get these jobs. And so really it was a good program. And in the process, 4,000 miles of road were improved. And so that's a good thing. Is another example of what road construction is still relying on horses and that. My grandfather was a surveyor for the Highway Department on the McDonald Pass project in 1930, and my great-grandparents had a ranch on the east side of McDonald Pass on Sweetie Creek. And so when they actually started building that highway project, my great-grandfather went to work for the Highway Department building that road, and he got paid extra because he had a horse team. So it really worked out pretty well for him. Worked out well for me because his daughter met my grandfather and they got married. So otherwise you'd be listening to somebody else up here. Might be someone better for all I know. But, they did have to use some heavy equipment for some of the excavation work. But again, there wasn't a whole lot of it going on then. This is a striping unit. It's quite a bit different than they do today. Actually, it kind of looks like fun to me, except you're facing the wrong way, so you wouldn't see death coming down the highway from the other direction. So, but it's called an Iowa. It's called a. Let's see if I can go back. It's called an Iowa striper. 1936, they reorganized the maintenance department or maintenance division, and it's really when a lot of the maintenance practices that we know today were really established. First section house was built on US 10 North up on McDonald Pass, and it's still there. It doesn't look much like this anymore, but all that siding, I believe, is underneath that ugly vinyl siding that's on it today. So, but they started building more and more section houses around the state to help facilitate the maintenance of these roads that they were building. And in the process, went from having the country's worst roads to having among the country's best roads. And so this is an example of one of those. This is Jefferson Canyon Road, US Highway 10 South. I believe that must be on the west side. I'm not sure. But part of this whole process is also paving roads that we don't usually think about them paving roads in the 1930s, but if you look at the highway maps of the time, you'll see that most of the major highways in Montana are paved by 1935. And they do that with a road oil mix. So they mix it in with gravel, and they create a real primitive bituminous surfacing that functioned as pavement for a long time. I have some across the street in my office. I should have brought it over. I'm the only person that I know of that was actually interested in this chunk of pavement that I found on one of our projects when I was doing my part of it. Another view of it from a different angle, the same road. This was also a very controversial project when it was let to contract, because some people didn't want the road to go through the canyon. They wanted to go along the old route down through Jefferson Island and through Harrison and then over. But cooler heads won out, and that particular highway was built. The road between Helena and Great Falls. If you wanted to go to Great Falls from here, you had to go up over Stemple or Fletcher Pass and then down Highway 200 into Great Falls. So this provided the first direct route by 1932 through the canyons up through there. These are all recently listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And we started trying to attract people to come to Montana to enjoy what we had to offer on these great roads. And in 1934, the highway commissioners appointed a man named Robert Fletcher to oversee the development of a tourism program. The highway department was responsible for the state's tourism program up through the early 1970s. It wasn't through Department of Commerce like it is today. So what we did was consciously go out there and try and welcome people to come to Montana. And that upper photograph shows one of the pylons that were at all the major entrances to the state. I'm not sure exactly where that one was located, but you can see the sign hanging off of it there. That was made out of copper, and it had the lettering printed on it. And then just down below it, you'll see that building. Keep that building in mind as we go along here. A few years ago, one of my colleagues, Deb Wambach, was down doing a project south of Dillon, and she found one of those old pylons sitting next to what used to be US Highway 91 just north of Oneida. So the guy on what would be your right is Robert Fletcher. Fletcher, there's only one other photograph I've ever seen of the guy, so I figured I'd show you something a little bit different. Fletcher essentially developed that tourism program based on what he'd seen that didn't work in other states, and kind of went on what he thought might be kind of a good thing for a tour. What were Montana's strengths then? It's basically what he built. Recreation is definitely one of them. Scenic qualities is another, and then the state's history was something he also really pushed. Essentially, the first tourism program, and this is the golden age of tourism during the 1930s, was developed by 3 or 4 guys sitting in an office just making it up as they went along. So, which I think makes it even better, you know, and using all these scientific and sociological things to decide how to do stuff. Fletcher in 1935 had initiated the biennial highway marker or highway map program. So these were all maps that were designed and fit in the glove compartment of the cars that you could take with you. The maps before this were done mostly for planning purposes. They weren't really very useful if you were a tourist trying to cross or use it or trying to visit Montana. Shorty Shope, some of you may have heard of Shorty Shope, was a fairly prominent local artist, and he was the department's graphic illustrator, and he did all the illustration work for this early tourism program, including the highway maps. My personal favorites, the highway markers. Fletcher initiated that program in 1935, installed 28 markers the first year. These weren't quite the markers that we're used to seeing today. They're on plywood sheets, and all the words were hand lettered onto those sheets. And then they varnished over them and set them up on those kind of bases. Bases, I hear, are going away because what isn't very good about them? They're not crashing. I mean, if you hit them, you stop. And I think they don't want you to just stop suddenly when you hit these bases, even though they're historic and they should, you know. But anyway, the one on the top is the Mullen Road marker. There's still a Mullen Road marker about in the same spot today. And the one in the lower corner is the Prickly Pear Diggins. This was just south of town on US 91. And it was up until not too long ago. Does anybody see a problem with it, for those of you that are close enough? This would be a problem with all the hand-lettered historical markers. Yeah, he's misspelled Prickly. And Prickly was on the sign when they replaced it a couple of years ago. They would just continue that over the years. In the late 1980s, a highway historical marker book came out, and in the book, the author says that some words like Holocaust, which are misspelled on the sign, she felt that they was there because it reflected local usage. I didn't want to tell her after all these years, no, it reflected the fact that somebody didn't know how to spell Holocaust. That's why it was spelled that way. And it was just perpetuated over the years. This was probably one of the most successful programs that Fletcher came up with, and one of the few of the 1930s programs that still exist. The stories are all written primarily as if you were watching a cowboy telling a story standing next to the road. Now that's basically it. And so they're not very accurate most of the time, but they were a hell of a lot of fun to read. There also was a lot of, you got to look back to the 1930s, that people were a little bit more insensitive than they are today. There was one marker up at Bad Rock Canyon that used the word war whoop, tomahawks, redskins all in one marker. So, of course, that one changed. And so, you know, the system has changed a little bit, but we've tried to incorporate as much of the original language in these as we possibly can. The Port of Entry program was another one. That little building in the background where that stone thing, that was the Port of Entry station, wherever it was that photo was taken. This was established in 1936. And tourists were encouraged to stop at these places at each of the ports of entry and ask questions. And these attendants would give them maps and information, tell them where the best campgrounds are, the best fishing holes are, and that type of thing. And that was really a popular program with the tourists because it made them feel like they were welcome in Montana. And this is a lower photograph is what one of the attendants looked like in the 1930s. They're all clean-cut college kids. The woman that they're talking to in the other photograph is Bob Fletcher's daughter. Her name was Pat, and she figures prominently in all the promotional brochures in the 1930s. And I gave a talk about the Port of Entry to the Last Chance Corral of the Westerners here a few years ago. And I mentioned that was Pat Fletcher there in the middle. Some guy pipes up and he says, yeah, she was really hot. Started talking about how hot she was. And then this old lady, you know, was sitting there. She must have been in her late 80s, says, are you kidding? She wasn't so great. And it started this 10-minute argument with people about whether Pat Fletcher was hot or not. How do I get him back on track? tough. This port of entry program stayed in effect until 1958, and it died about the same time the interstate program got going, because people weren't going to be able to stop along the interstate and do this when that system was completed. Lots of promotional brochures, promotional material came out of the department in the 30s. The picture writing there on the bottom is if you have a key, you can read all this. It's all in hieroglyphics that Fletcher made up, that you had to match the little glyphs with the captions on the photographs. It's a pain in the butt to read, but it's kind of fun. Probably kept some kids pretty happy or active while they were sitting in the back seat of some of these cars. We bought pictograph caves down outside of Billings. We bought them specifically as a tourist attraction. It's one of the first state parks. And we built a little museum there and operated that up until the late 1940s. We also built at least one museum there on the lower end. This one's at the corner of Main Street. Well, it's on Main Street just before the road down to the overpass. In Laurel, it was built in 1938. It was filled with artifacts that came from pictograph caves. There was a Crow Indian man and his family that lived in a teepee on the grounds. He was the caretaker of the museum and also gave demonstrations on Native American life. And we're still kind of wondering what happened to all those artifacts that were in the museum. It turns out, probably, is there any relatives of Bob Fletcher here? Turns out, Bob Fletcher, chairman of the Highway Commission at that time, a guy named Lee Ford, were avid collectors of arrowheads and projectile points and other Native American artifacts. And so what I think, and I might be totally wrong about this, I kind of hope I am, is a lot of those artifacts that were in this museum are somehow in the possession of the Fletcher family today, or of the Ford family. That I don't think they ever made it to where they were supposed to go when the museum closed. So they're still trying to track down exactly where those were at. Highway Patrol was formed in 1935, specifically to enforce highway rules, which hadn't really been done before. It's up to the local sheriffs and police officers. And then on December 7th, 1941, really the first golden age. The first golden age came to a crashing end on December 7th, 1941. I know some of you guys know what that date means. You all know what happened that day? Yeah. All right. At the meeting of the Highway Commission on December 8th, 1941, most of the Highway Department's programs came to an end because that federal money that we were getting, in large amounts, was being rechanneled to the war effort. So from 1941 to about mid-1945, there was virtually no construction projects going on along the highways in Montana. There wasn't even much maintenance going on, just really the basics, what they had to do. But there were some highways where they could spend federal money. One of them was Highway 91 between Butte and Great Falls, because of the refinery up there. Right around the Billings area, U.S. Highway 10, for most of its length, was all strategic highway. And so in 1944, when ice washed out the Yellowstone River Bridge in Fallon, they were able to get enough money to build a new steel bridge to take its place. This is the current, well, one of the bridges there. There's an interstate bridge right next to it. So this was the most massive bridge project that we built during the whole Great Depression era in World War II. It was very expensive, crossing the Yellowstone River, and they couldn't find any steel workers to work on it because, you know, the experienced men were working in the war industries on the West Coast. So they found a spot where there were a lot of experienced steel workers, and you would never guess where. The Crow Reservation. So this bridge was built almost entirely of Crow Indian labor because they had the experience to do the steel work. But again, that's really the only big project that happens during World War II. There's some smaller ones going on. There's a Crow mine south of Absorki, so that those little secondary roads that we have there today were important to the war effort. So they were receiving maintenance and upgrades, but really nothing was going on in the state except stockpiling gravel during World War II. And then things are really going to get exciting in the 1950s. And so I have to stop there. So, and that's for the next time. So, but if there's any questions, it's just a very basic overview of what we've done. But this department, I think, has been, you know, probably more than a lot of the other state agencies. I might not, should probably say that. It's really been critical to the history of the state, and mainly because you need good roads to do anything. And if it wasn't for us, they wouldn't have had those roads. So I think we should be awfully proud of ourselves for the work that we've done here over the last 100 years. But, now I'm pontificating. So, are there any questions? Yes, sir.
How did they come up with the numbering system of the highway? You got everything from 1 to 200.
1 to 200. Well, it's not very complicated. And the Highway Commission had virtually nothing to do with it. We all know about AASHTO today, right? Back then it was AASHO, which I'm glad they kind of changed the AASHO. It was American Association of State Highway Officials. And that was, you know, just like AASHTO is today. It was really it was really important to this whole process. So AASHTO came up with the numbering system. And so, of course, all the east-west highways are even numbered, all the north-south highways are odd numbered, just like they are with the interstates today, too. And so they were all designed so that it would create an interstate highway system. So you could follow U.S. Highway 10 all the way across the country, or U.S. Highway 10, or whatever. So we had virtually no input into that. That system was largely in place by 1930. The process started in 1926, and it was over with by 1930. But if you read the Highway Commission books, you know, even into the 1930s, they refer to U.S. 89 as the YGB line, or U.S. 10 as the Yellowstone Trail, that type of thing. So there's still those old popular designations of the highways that survive up through the 1930s. Now, of course, they're almost virtually forgotten today. So does that answer your question? All right. Any other questions? Well, thank you for coming. Hopefully we'll see you. Oh, I forgot one more picture. This guy is important. This is Bud Natz, who was a highway commissioner in the 1960s and 70s. So, no. No, there's a huge grasshopper infestation in eastern Montana during the Depression. And so some photographer in Glasgow came up with the great idea of doing things like this and selling them as postcards. This is probably the most famous of them, but I think it's kind of ironic that the future highway commissioner that's in the photograph